What's up, everybody? It's Kevin and Sergey once again welcoming you back to the channel in yet another episode in our Antares lore series.
This episode, we're finally talking about the Vorl, Ordo, the most dangerous threat to PanHumanity in Antares space. And we're talking about them this week because we have seen several teasers on the Intel Facebook page of Voral models, so we can only assume they're right around the corner.
This is very exciting because everybody on the Intel has been in a fever pitch forever about the release of the Vorl, and so we think it's finally going to happen. Now, when talking about the Vorl, it is incredibly important to kind of build up a mental image of what a Vorl is, because it is quite alien and kind of hard to get your head wrapped around, but it's awesome. And what the Vorl are incredibly advanced insectoid aliens that each individual is actually built up of 3 separate subspecies, creating this like form of trisymbiosis in the ultimate form, which is referred to as a zoogon. So an individual Vorl is a zoogon, and a zoogon is made up of 3 separate subspecies. These zoogons band together in incredibly tight-knit family nests that end up being kind of like ruled over or represented by, almost more accurately, a single zoogon who is considered to best represent their kind of like ethos, philosophies, and their pheromonal signatures. These zoogon leaders of a Voral nest are referred to by PanHumanity as hearth mothers. And this is a term used even though they are just hermaphroditic or on a little bit parthenogenic actually as well. There's a lot of biological terms used in the description of Voral.
Multiple hives in close proximity will often band together for common defense into a grouping known as an Ordo. These Ordo are led by a single zoogon known as a war chief that is selected by the various hearth mothers. This war chief will represent the kind of collective ethos, feelings, and pheromonal signature of the entire collective. It's important to note that these war chiefs aren't like individual leaders like you would see in a pan-human society. Rather, they're just a physical embodiment of the collective. Individuality isn't really a thing in Voral society in the same way that it would be to a human.
Now, not to confuse anybody, but where an Ordo is comprised of many different nests, those nests together are referred to by the Voral themselves as a synthesis. And it's kind of like a civilization, if you would imagine, in a normal pan-human society. And these syntheses are quite large now in like the advanced Antaran history that we find ourselves in, whereas the Voral, when they were less advanced, might have only consisted of like 10,000 individuals in a synthesis. Now Ordos and syntheses can like go across entire stretches of Antaran space, many worlds, and contain billions of individuals. This incredible proliferation really freaks out normal pan-human civilizations in Antaran space because they rightly fear the Voral as just these like insane genocidal, like, you know, violent race of aliens. And that is because, I mean, to a Voral, a normal pan-human is really perceived as just like a semi-sapient, you know, basically one step above an animal, just like blundering around, not even really understanding the advanced technologies that they wield, even though in pan-human's defense, they are quite advanced. From the Voral perspective, their Ordo and synthesis really are peaceful communities, because just like the integrated machine intelligence of like the Concord, for instance, the Voral, you know, in their synthesis do exist as kind of a harmonious body that is just focused on, you know, keeping each nest alive. But the problem is that the Voral get this bad rap because of how they, you know, react to the presence of even other Voral. And the way it works is basically, you know, in the sense of a pan-human, when they interact with them, they're just so physiologically different and so unlike-minded that they react in the same way as when they meet a Voral who also exhibits differences, and that is to massively increase their own breeding capability in an attempt to secure the most territory around them for feeding grounds, space to live for new Voral, and that inevitably means that they're basically destroying everything in their wake and killing anything that moves that isn't Voral.
These conflicts essentially end up being something more like an extermination for the Vorl, because they are physiologically incapable of harmoniously interacting with creatures that don't have at least some Vorl traits.
And even in the case of some Voral traits, they're still just as bad.
yeah, they're not too nice to each other either. They're very warlike society. They're kind of like the Gar, but smarter, which is
that's
horrifying.
True. They're more efficient.
Yeah, they're like the Gar if the Gar really knew what they were about. Now, the difference between the Gar and the Vorl is that the Vorl do not eschew modern technology. In fact, they sort of have the same technological base as PanHumanity, in that they both started off their technological exploration in Antares space from builder tech that they found there. This means that you'll see similar technology, such as like reflex fields and plasma technology, but utilized in slightly different ways to suit the Vorl, as those technological branches have kind of diverged over time.
Now, we've said how weird the Vorl are, and so I would like to take it to a more in-depth look at the actual physicality, because they're incredibly weird and awesome designs for aliens. I love the Vorl's look. And the best way to describe it is almost as if it has the same body plan as a scorpion, but whereas a scorpion has a sting on the end of its tail, that's where the head of a Vorl sits. And it's got a few extra limbs in there too. But, you know, regardless to how alien they are in comparison to PanHumanity, they are the second most, you know, prolific species in all of the Antaran universe, and so they are quite successful. Like I said earlier, a Vorl as an individual is known as a zoogon, even though it is technically made up of 3 different like subspecies. These 3 subspecies having like evolved with one another, either naturally, potentially by genetic engineering, but each one of these pieces now basically can't exist without the other ones. Like, for instance, the head doesn't have really anything in the way of like a digestive or reproductive tract. And so, you know, separate the main zoogon, they're only going to have so much time in this, you know, realm of existence. Now, I'm going to get these terms wrong about 1,000 times. But the 3 individuals broken up and looked at separately, the head is known as the cephalite. The portion of the body which is kind of like the, I guess you call it the legs, which has like a grazing mouth and the digestive tract, is the ambulite. And then the, you know, middle piece that has kind of like the limbs that are used for fine manipulation is the torsite. Interestingly enough, the ambulite and the torsite can actually exist for like a week or so, separate of the main zoogon, but they can't survive further than that. So they all have to come back together at some point, no matter what.
The cephalite, or head of the Vorl, is typified by its highly developed brain. It also has a respiratory system, so it can breathe, and tiny little limbs, so it can do some fine motor stuff. However, it notably lacks a digestive tract. It can only receive food from the other parts of like its symbiote form. To be specific, and also really gross, it has 2 little like feeder patches on the bottom of it. Yeah, that eats a honey, I guess, a honey that is secreted from
goo. Voral goo.
The Voral royal goo that is secreted from the other parts of its body that then sustains the head.
It's like sort of like a bee or an ant, kind of regurgitating into the other workers' mouths. It makes sense.
In the grossest way panhumanly possible. Some cephalites actually take on a life living almost entirely separate of the rest of their symbiotes. And they do this because they can kind of be small and have a bunch of fine motor control and like crawl through ship's corridors and stuff to do fine repairs. This type of cephalite also acts as pilots and other sorts of technicians. And they survive for extended periods of time separate of their body because they have like sort of like a feeding sac that they attach to themselves that gives them synthesized goo.
The good stuff.
The good stuff. However, they do from time to time have to return to the rest of their symbiotes in order to have like a healthy brain chemistry and not, I assume, like, I don't know, go
crazy.
insane or something. Yeah.
Well, when you're like three subspecies that exist as one for most of the time, I'm assuming you have detachment issues, physically and mentally.
Yeah. He like leaves for work in the day, puts on his hat, and then he sees his body like clawing at the window. Like
Oh my god, that's hilarious. On the opposite end of the spectrum, the ambulite is the bottommost part of the whole zoogon, and it is kind of responsible for digestion and nutrients as well as locomotion. And it itself does possess kind of like a pseudo head on the front that it uses for grazing, but more importantly, it has a very complicated digestive tract, almost like a cow, like multiple stomachs and whatnot. And this allows them to not only feed nutrients into the torsite, but also produce that weird goo jelly like honeybee stuff that Sergey was talking about. And it's actually bizarre because the ambulite doesn't really have any intelligence like the head would, and as such, when it's separated, it basically operates like a cow and just walks around and grazes on food. But this is incredibly important because it needs to have this grazing time so that it is able to provide the nutrients for the entire zoogon to exist. And this is actually kind of interesting because it's one of the aspects that inform the reason why the Voral are so expansionist and violent when they're battling for territory. They basically need huge swaths of land in which they have kind of planted their native flora and fauna so that these ambulites are able to graze and feed the population as a whole. If they cannot provide that space for grazing, the ambulite does not produce food that is nutritious enough for the rest of the body, and in fact, if it's not fed the right things, it will actually create food that is toxic to the other part and basically poison the whole.
The final section we're going to talk about is the torsite, and it's kind of the middle section of the Voral that has its like arms and stronger limbs. And when separated from the body, it kind of reverts into something of like an ape-like insectoid creature that swings around in trees and grazes in the fern forests of the Voral. Its diet of nuts and berries and the various things that grow in these fern forests is actually what allows it to produce the gross goo that we have been referring to that feeds the cephalites.
Oh, that's right. Yes, I'm sorry. I said that wrong. The bottom does not feed the top. It's like a human centipede, and I keep getting it wrong. It's like one goes to the other, goes to the other.
This need for these fern forests further spurs the Voral into aggressive expansion, because not only do they need what I'm assuming are plains for the bottom half, or bottom third to graze on, they also need these forests for their middle third to graze on. So it really, they require huge swaths of territory to even exist as a society.
I'm really digging this kind of War of the Worlds vibe I'm getting from them, because it's the same thing as like the red lichen that is like seeded onto the planet as the invaders come in, is because they need to have it growing so that when they take over, they're ready to go as far as their weird nutrient chain.
Yeah, or like the Zerg with their creep or whatever it's called.
Yeah, the creep, the pudding that stretches across the, no bueno. I had said that the Voral reproduce prolifically. And the reason why that is the case is because they are, hermaphroditical, parthenogenic, and in that weird alien version of those two things, it's almost like cannibalism too.
Well, it's not almost like cannibalism.
It is very cannibalism, And the reason why is it's so breeding is a very communal thing for the Voral. And there are a lot of things that trigger it to happen in kind of waves, rather than like with panhumans, where I'm imagining it's like a constant kind of just, constant process. And the most common are if an Ordo interacts with another rival Ordo, or like panhumans, alien threat, anything like that. And basically what happens is the war chief releases a certain kind of pheromone that when ingested by all the other zoogons in their particular nest, triggers the reproductive response. And the reason why it's cannibalism is because the most common response is a Voral looks at the next Voral next to it, and then one eats the other and repurposes that person's DNA to create the offspring. And that's kind of how they answer like the advantage of having DNA splicing. Now, it is important to note though, that in an instant where the Voral finds itself unable to reproduce in this way, they can actually just asexually reproduce by, I assume, budding, in which they copy their own DNA. after they develop in these weird eggs, they are kind of like wrapped in a membrane and exist in some kind of like weird larval stage in which competition starts immediately.
The larvae develop within a skin fold on the torsite, and they survive off of the nutrients that the torsite gives them, but that's not enough. So they have to actually consume each other in order to survive. They have this horrible little writhing larva war that cuts their numbers down to about a half dozen per clutch.
Survival of the fittest.
And the grossest.
Once their larval numbers have been whittled down, so to speak, they do kind of like enter like a weird pupa stage in which they fall out of these skin folds and are collected into, I'm assuming, gross piles by the other Vorl. And once they hatch, they're not quite full Vorl zoogons yet. They've kind of, I would assume it's like a nymph stage. They're like incompletely metamorphosized. And at that point, they are kind of herded into family groups and communally raised.
Now, after hearing that horrific birth cycle, one can probably glean that the Vorl aren't too sentimental. They don't really have individual wants and feelings as much as they care about their collective and their strong bond as a whole family.
When you like eat your girlfriend when you want to go SETI, that makes a lot of sense. So you're like, I don't really.
As a zoogon matures, they first kind of form a bond with their local nest. But as they branch out and kind of leave that nest, they form a bond with their Ordo as a whole. And this is kind of the backbone of Voral society. They are extremely collectivist and care about the cohesive unit as opposed to individuals.
This can make it hard to wrap your head around Voral society because they are, to an extent, a hive mind, but it is weird because it's like they're just a touch more individualistic than a full-on hive mind. And it's weird, but they do believe as a race and a society, they have a strong sense of justice and egalitarianism. And so they are more advanced than what you'd imagine as like an ant colony or a bee colony where the drones are kind of mindless. And they do actually enjoy adventure and combat specifically. My absolute favorite fact that I've learned in reviewing the Voral society.
An unexpected fact, to be honest with you. Yeah.
Is that one of the things that they enjoy doing is actually like communally consuming intoxicants. Like, I don't know what that means, if it's alcohol or something similar.
The lore says it's an alcohol
there you go. So
substance.
They basically get wasted, and this makes them go like battle lust mode, and they just kind of like usher out of their nest to another nest and basically like engage in a combat that doesn't see like a bunch of people dying necessarily, but it is like their way of like it's
it's a bar brawl raid.
Yeah, it's like they like blow off steam, but they also do kind of like create a social hierarchy, like, hey, we're the, don't mess with us. We beat your butt up the other day. Yeah. But it's so funny, but it's also cool because it does just like, it gives you this weird little window into being like, like they're not, like I said, they're not quite a weird hive mind. I don't know, but the Vorl throw amazing ragers.
they're the in-between point between
they're like, we'd get along with the PanHumans if they could pull off a keg stand. Like, come on.
Oh my god. They also use these ragers as an excuse to synthesize a bit of DNA, because they'll just be like, and take a chunk out of one of their rivals in order to gain some of their DNA to make their hive stronger, which is just wild.
Weird. But it's also cool because Sergey off camera had talked about, it's like, it does remind me of the 40K crew, which was was always sweet because they did the same thing. They'd like eat little bits, just little bits, get a little DNA.
This love of fighting absolutely propagates out to the Voral military, going so far as to the Voral believing that a death in combat is an extremely glorious death, because once again, it's sacrificing yourself for the collective, and they don't care about the individual, they care about the whole. This collectivist attitude is typified in the fact that the Vorl don't really care so much for individual glorification. They have some things that they want, like they want to die for their community, but they don't aggrandize the self. This can be seen with how they treat their dead, which is that they don't really care when somebody dies. They don't even really care when a leader dies because their genetic material can be recycled. They can eat a powerful warrior, create almost an exact DNA clone of him via their strange reproductive route, and then replace that person with the offspring. This practice has led to panhumans mistakenly thinking that Vorals have an incredibly long lifespan because they'll keep seeing the same warrior century after century with the same name, because they don't even change their name when they make a clone like that. And so the humans think they live for thousands of years, but it's just the same dude reproduced over and over and over again.
On the note of Voral names, they're kind of hilarious.
They have cool names.
They do have cool names. They're more based around like nature of objects or physicalities, or even like, you know, based off like events and whatnot. So like in the book, it references like Crouching Gnaw, Dark Fang, Scything Wind, and Drunken Charger, which we need to immediately invent the army of Drunken Charger.
Yeah,
known for their Voral brew and their rageful drunk swings. Like, aside from like the individual, even Ordos usually have names that are based on like physicality. So like the Red Claws, or like the Third Toe, or like, I don't know what, the Yellow Spines.
The third toe might be a weird one. I don't know how many toes they have, but
that race had 3.
specifically.
All of this like physicality and harshness of society rolls into the Voral's attitude towards panhumans, which are the, you know, next largest and most prolific race in Antares that they run into all the time, as like oddly like squishy and soft. And those are like the nicknames they say they have for us, is it's like you're wet and squishy and like weakling, I don't know. And
Get
it
out
really
of here, you soft skin.
Exactly. And they like just really don't get us. But they are obviously a little bit more like to, you know, get along with like more similar arthropodic kind of life forms like the Ascar, like space crabs, for instance.
Space crabs are not canon. As one can imagine, the close-knit community of the Voral and their collaborative nature makes them organize into a military unit very, very effectively.
Whereas on the battlefield, you're not going to ever see the Voral kind of fighting alongside anything like panhumans or even most aliens. The one exception is they do kind of understand and trust the Ascar. And so it's not uncommon to see them fighting alongside a Voral Ordo.
It's important to note that the Ascar are not equipped with Voral weapons, mostly because it's too large and unwieldy for an Ascar to use. So what you'll see is the Ascar being equipped with looted, stolen, smuggled weapons. So they'll be equipped in much the same way you would see them in a regular panhuman army. While this is somewhat inconvenient for the Voral, the Ascar really do make up an integral part of any Voral military fighting force.
Pulling back a little bit and getting into a little bit of the history, while the Voral were most likely connected to the Antaran Nexus, chronologically speaking, in a similar time frame that humanity was, they were really only encountered during the Third Age of Antares. From the moment they were encountered, they were considered an implacable enemy that just was incredibly hostile and just, you know, violently expansionist. The perception of the Voral has been and always will be that they don't even require you to basically aggress against them. They're going to attack, and even more so when the offense actually happens and that you're able to destroy like a Voral planet or even like a single Voral ship, the reaction is always the same, and that is like the complete and utter mobilization of an entire Ordo hell-bent on destroying whatever threat was, you know, attacking them at the time. This resulted in all of the insane battles and horrible violence of the Third Age, and was reintroduced to Antaran space in the opening of the Fourth.
Their aggression was so great during the Fourth Age that they were actually able to topple the Zon Empire. If you've watched our previous videos, you'll know that's a really big deal, as they were the primary panhuman faction in all of Antaran space at the time.
The horror of the Vorl invasion continued on into the Fifth Age, where it started much earlier and kind of, colored the age of the Warring Age with just extreme amounts of violence. And it was so far that in the Sixth Age, when they didn't reappear, it actually became a common thought that the Vorl had thankfully destroyed themselves and would never return. Until they did.
They were so powerful in the Sixth Age that all three remaining panhuman factions banded together to become the Tri-Sapient Alliance just as a reaction to this threat.
The Vorl's battle with this Tri-Sapient Alliance became so epic and insane that basically led to the events of the Sixth Collapse and the dawn of the Seventh Age. In the Seventh Age, the current age of Antares, the Vorl now control basically 1/3 of Antaran space, with the other 2/3 mainly being controlled by the now fractured Imtel Society of the Concord and the Isaurians. And really the only thing that keeps them at bay currently is the fact that PanHumanity has finally been able to achieve a technological equal to the Vorl, and the nature of the Vorl themselves is that each Ordo kind of does infight and prevents the greater, Vorl space from spilling out into this orgiastic bloodbath.
The territories that the Vorl control across the entire Nexus are known as the Extents, the Dominion, or just kind of areas of Vorl control because they're so dangerous that very little is actually known about them. This Dominion is made up of countless Ordo that do, in fact, war with each other almost as much as they war with PanHumanity.
This seems odd that these, inner conflicts would persist so much, but it's basically just how the Vorl operate. When they meet another Ordo, like we said before, it's the exact same thing as if they meet an alien threat. Their reproduction rates go through the roof, and they just naturally try to expand outwards and take over. Even if it's another Vorl, they're going in and destroying all their rivals and allowing their philosophies and ethos and whatnot of their, individual society to overlap over all of the surrounding neighbors in an attempt to have them all be in one fold.
Exactly. There's sort of like a societal perfectionism within the Vorl, because it's noted that even if a weaker Vorl community beats out a stronger Vorl community, they will assimilate to the stronger Vorl community because they understand that that's better for their collective.
Exactly. And these fights, are able to kind of hobble them in their overall, Antaran expansion, because the fights between Ordos can sometimes be even more brutal, because basically they are like ant colonies in this sense, because they will fight to the last zoogon. And they will expend all of their resources to do such. So it is, thankfully, I don't even think the Panhuman empires realize this, but this kind of saves them, because right now the Concord and the Isaurian, who are infighting, really should be pooling resources, combining efforts to destroy the Vorl, but they're not doing that. And it'll probably be something that they will, learn to regret, as the fiction states. Now, this is where the official information that Tim wrote up for Antares version 2 basically ends, which, by the way, we found all this information that we've used for this episode in the Universe Guide, which can be downloaded for free at the Antares Nexus, which we'll have a link in the description below.
Which is awesome and expansive.
Oh, it's so cool. Yeah, there's so much to read. And for those that are interested, it's basically page 68 to page 71. And for those of you that are interested in kind of reading in more detail, rather than have me and Sergey stumble verbally over the technical readouts of all these incredibly complicated weapons, check that document out, because it actually goes into more detail. But everything that they present, the Vorl are so cool. We've said it in previous videos, but they're so good at conceptualizing truly alien aliens.
Yeah, very alien.
They're weird.
Yeah, they're weird to the point where it's hard to sometimes understand them, which is exactly what an alien should be.
But I love it because it really speaks to my love of classic science fiction, because you get these weird Starship Trooper vibes from them to a degree, because in Starship Troopers, the book, the aliens are very much like the Vorl in the sense that they're insects that have technology and whatnot and weird societies. But from the outside looking in, it's so cool how they're like weird ant colonies that like terraform the area around them.
I honestly think that's the
It's
coolest
so
part
cool.
of them.
Yeah, it's so
you
cool.
can get these awesome visuals in your head of like massive planet-wide expanding fern forests with like zoogons swinging from vines like around it. It's crazy.
Yeah. And it's great for me like as a terrain builder, because like if you're gonna have fights where you're doing offenses against the Vorl, it really does make sense to have their area completely terraformed, because to them, like it says that they use like basically like biocides and like anti-organic like gas weapons to just literally like clear an area of all native flora and fauna and then just seed the world with what they need to survive, which is their weird, you know, biosphere. But it's really neat. It's really cool. And it's a really neat take on that, you know, aspect of like the invading alien that needs to terraform. Like I said, really War of the Worlds, which is really cool.
I'm very interested to see how the Voral play on the battlefield. I'm also excited to see more Askar on any battlefield, to be honest with you.
Oh, yes. I'm so happy that the creation of the Voral means that there's a good chance that new Askar units are going to come out, which are my favorite aliens in wargaming.
But let us know. It matters much less what we think about the Voral. We want to know what you think about the Voral in the comments down below. Are you as excited as we are for the Voral finally coming to Antares space?
And while you're down in the comment section, you should just go all out and help us support our channel in the easiest way possible. Leaving that comment, liking the video, subscribing to the channel, of course, if you have not done so already, and making sure that notifications are enabled so you can see when new videos like this come out.
If you want to support us even further, there's an affiliate link and a link to TTW swag in the description below. And if you want to support us in the best way humanly possible, join our Patreon community where you'll gain access to bonus content.
Well, I hope you're as excited as we are for the Voral to finally make their debut in Antares space. And until then, we will see you on the tabletop.
Space crabs are not canon.
They are now. It's a fan supported game system. Crabs, they coming for you. Don't edit that part out. That's me. I'm editing it out. Okay.
What is wrong?
I don't know.
Oh god, that was funny.
So